On May the 5th, 1971, in the then USSR, Anatoly and Lyudmila Gotlib would welcome into the world a baby girl by the name of Anne Gotlib. Anne would go on to become a household name in the USA in the mid-80s, sadly for all the wrong reasons. This is the story of Anne Gotlib, the girl who vanished.
It's here, our annual GE inventory clearance sale, with gigantic savings on selected General Electric major appliances. This once-a-year event is your big chance.
From her birth in 1971, not much is recorded about Anne's upbringing, but it's commonly believed she enjoyed a happy and loving childhood. In 1980, Anne would immigrate with her family to the United States. Being a bright and talented young girl, fluent in both her native Russian and English. Her family would settle in Louisville, Kentucky, living in an apartment complex at 2213 Gerald Court. Being a young girl on the verge of her teenage years, she enjoyed attending school and making friends. On June the 1st, 1983, on her first day of summer vacation from school, Anne would take a bus to the local Jewish community centre on Dutchman's Lane. Here, she would enjoy a game of tennis with her friend and classmate, Rachel Podgorski. Rachel's mother then drove Anne back home, where she would collect her bicycle and take a ride to visit another friend, Tanya Okmiansky. The girls watched television and chatted for a while before Anne's mother, Lyudmila, called Tanya's home and asked her to return. Anne and Tanya would then ride back part way together. As they neared the Bacon's department store at the Bashford Manor Mall, Tanya waved her friend Anne goodbye. It was reported Anne may have entered the mall and visited a pet store, as some say she was seen petting a kitten. After this, Anne vanished. Hours passed. Anne's mother began to worry and headed out to look for her. It was then that her mother would find Anne's bike leaning up against the wall at the Bacon's department store. Her mother noticed the bike's kickstand was down, which she found confusing, since Anne knew the kickstand was broken and therefore never used it. After this discovery, her mother, Lyudmila, contacted police and reported Anne missing. After the first initial inquiries were made, the FBI would take lead on the investigation into Anne's disappearance, while the local police would follow up on hundreds and hundreds of leads. On June the 3rd, 1983, 2 days after Anne's disappearance, 2 young girls came forward, stating they believed they had seen Anne struggling with a man who was walking her away from the mall towards a wooded area. They reported the young girl looked like Anne, but at the time believed it may have just been a parent and child arguing, and therefore paid it no real notice. A search of the wooded area was undertaken, but no evidence of Anne or her abductor were ever found. 3 days after Anne's disappearance, on June the 4th, 1983, a police sniffer dog would pick up Anne's scent and trace it back to the home of Esther Okmiansky, who was the grandmother of the last person to reportedly see Anne alive, Tanya Okmiansky. Esther claimed that Anne had never visited the apartment, and after extensive investigation into the home and its inhabitants, the officers concluded that the dog had detected the odour of Anne at the apartment in error, and this line of inquiry was closed. As the investigation heated up, news coverage, flyers, and even billboards were distributed throughout the surrounding area in an attempt to keep her face and disappearance within the public consciousness. hoping this would turn up further leads and tips. A $15,000 reward was also placed, offered to anyone who came forward with information on Anne's whereabouts. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. As the public slowly forgot about Anne and carried on with their lives, the Gotlib family and FBI investigators would continue to follow up on leads and question suspects. To this day, a total of 30 to 40 suspects had been questioned about the disappearance of Anne. However, none of these suspects were ever charged with her disappearance at the time. Of these 30 to 40 suspects questioned and investigated, one of them was a convicted sex offender who had reportedly been at the mall within hours of Anne's disappearance, and another suspect who was a serial sex offender. This suspect, however, supplied an alibi for the time of Anne's disappearance, and no charge was ever brought forth on either. During this time, ECHO, also known as the Exploited Children's Help Organisation, which had been established a month prior to Anne's disappearance, worked tirelessly to reach out to the public, hoping they might find someone who knew something about what happened on that day. Before systems were introduced, like the Amber Alert system, they created postcards with Anne's face and information on and distributed them throughout the local area. So what do we know? A 12-year-old girl, visiting her local mall, disappears in the late afternoon, leaving nothing behind but her bicycle. Up to 40 suspects had been questioned and hundreds of lines of inquiry followed, all leading to dead ends. Anne Gottlieb had simply vanished. With no suspects and no leads, people began to theorise what might have happened to Anne on June the 1st, 1983. One of the more far-fetched theories claims that Anne had been abducted by the Soviet government and taken back to the USSR in an attempt to force her parents, Anatoly and Ludmila, to return to Russia. This, however, is wildly disputed by the FBI and the Gottlieb family themselves. Another theory states that Anne was simply struggling to adapt to her new life in the USA, and because of this, had decided to leave and try and find her way home. This, too, is widely disputed by the Gottlieb family, who claim Anne was a happy young child who was enjoying life, showing no signs of anxiety and no signs of having issues living in the US. Leaving her bicycle, taking no money and no possessions, also highlights this theory as unlikely. 7 years after her disappearance, a possible lead would appear. In 1990, a man came forward claiming to have kidnapped and killed Anne Gottlieb. This man was Michael Lee Lockhart. Michael Lee Lockhart was born September 30th, 1960, in Walbridge, Ohio. Michael was a serial killer whose crimes had spanned across 1987 and 1988. On March 22nd, 1988, Michael was apprehended after a high-speed chase, which had ensued after an officer, Paul Halsey Jr., tried to apprehend Michael for driving a stolen vehicle. Michael would kill Officer Halsey Jr. during this altercation. Once arrested, evidence of his prior crimes had been found inside the vehicle. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Officer Paul Halsey Jr. and later convicted of the murder of 16-year-old Wendy Gallagher. Following this, he pleaded guilty to the further murder of 14-year-old Florida teen Jennifer Colheur, earning him life sentences in 3 states: Texas, Indiana, and Florida. he was currently on death row in Texas, awaiting his execution when these claims were made. He had previously stated to police he had killed between 20 to 30 young girls, though this is unproven. He stated he had killed Anne and buried her body at Fort Knox, handing a hastily drawn map to detectives describing the location of Anne's remains. However, after the thorough and extensive search of the area marked on the map, no remains, no Anne, and no physical evidence to support his claims were ever found. Michael's claims of murdering Anne are now believed to be a hoax. On December the 9th, 1997, Michael was executed via lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. 18 years after Michael's claims, in 2008, the story of Anne would take another turn. December 4th, 2008, Louisville Metro Police Department announced a major break in the case. A spokesperson for LMPD suggested that they knew who had kidnapped and killed Anne Gotlib. This person was Gregory Oakley Jr. Gregory was a former veterinarian turned convicted felon. His crimes? Burglary and rape. The rape was interesting to LMPD, as the victim was a young girl around Anne's age, with red hair and of a similar appearance to Anne. Unfortunately, this realisation would come too late, as Gregory had passed away in 2002 after being released from Kentucky State Reformatory on a medical pardon, where he was serving time for the burglary and rape of a 13-year-old girl. What makes this even more heartbreaking is Gregory was an initial suspect in the case of Anne's disappearance back in 1983. The theory LMPD believe is that Gregory had spotted Anne heading towards the Bashford Manor Mall on her bicycle. As she leaned her bike up against the wall of the Bacon's department store, Gregory exited his vehicle and approached and abducted Anne, leaving nothing behind but her bicycle. This theory was further confirmed by an ex-cellmate of Gregory's, who during the late 80s and early 90s had served time with Gregory in a Kentucky prison. Gregory confessed to this inmate on multiple occasions that he indeed had abducted and murdered Anne, stated he had taken her and killed her by administering a lethal dose of Tarwin, an opioid painkiller used to treat moderate to severe pain. Gregory had been on the police radar as a suspect in the disappearance of Anne since 1984, around the time he was arrested and convicted of the rape of another young Louisville girl. Gregory had even failed polygraph tests administered by the police. Unfortunately, LMPD and the FBI lacked any physical evidence that they could tie Gregory to Anne's disappearance at the time. The story of Anne Gotlib remains a sad tale to this day, of a young girl on the verge of beginning her life, a tale that really doesn't have a conclusive ending. The shocking way in which Anne had disappeared from a crowded public area in broad daylight meant that Anne's case would become key in the United States Congress, creating the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984, meaning departments can better coordinate on cases of missing persons. Anne's case is credited with increasing public knowledge and awareness for missing and abducted children, and revolutionised the way missing person cases are initially handled. Anne's case was also one of the first to use public billboards and similar awareness tactics, which at the time were considered futile. Researchers created an age progression photograph showing what Anne Gotlib may look like today. We will never truly know what happened to Anne on that day in 1983. Her parents, Anatoly and Ludmila Gotlib, now in their 70s and 80s, still hold onto that small shred of hope that one day they will get full closure on the disappearance of their daughter. Speaking on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance in 2008, Anne's mother, Ludmila, stated, "People are still looking. They are still searching. There are still investigations. It really gives us hope that someday, hopefully in our lifetime, everything will be solved."